Hello and welcome to the webinar regarding the 2023 National Building Code Alberta Edition. My name's Darryl Paul, and we're here to help you to understand what some of the changes are that are going to occur when this new building code comes into play. I've been in construction for the last 45 years. I am involved in a lot of different construction activities. I do a lot of building envelope investigations, a lot of energy efficiency, and I'm involved with the Part 9 information that is regarding residential construction. And so with myself here, Darryl Paul, Kent, I'll get you to introduce yourself.
I'm Kent Pearson. I'm a registered energy advisor and Red Seal journeyman carpenter. I've been in the industry for a little over 10 years now, and I primarily do Part 9 Energy Code compliance, and I'm working with building officials to help them understand all the changes that are occurring right now. So these building code changes are coming from our national level, and then every province across the country is creating or will create their own provincial version of that model national code.
So with the national code, what are some of the ways that we get the national code? For instance, the national code covers the whole country. So when we look at things like, New Brunswick, or we'll look at BC, some of the code is going to change to where we are in Alberta. So how does it come about that we have this national model code and it comes to Alberta and it actually suits where we are?
So with the harmonization across the country of the national building code, all the provinces have agreed to line their provincial code with that baseline. And the purpose of this is to increase the competitiveness within the provincial and territorial sectors.
Yeah, so I know from the previous codes, it used to be that the national code would come up as a model, and then when that model code came out, what would happen is each province would determine whether they were going to adopt it and how long they were going to take. So some codes were behind 2 cycles in some provinces. So now with this harmonized code, it gives us some time to be able to look at the national code. A year and a half to 2 years later, we implement that national code provincially. But like you said, it makes a big difference because now it's harmonized across the country to within a couple of years instead of major points in time.
And with the greater uniformity within the building, plumbing, and fire safety codes, this is going to bring new products into our market that wouldn't have been available otherwise because they felt Canada was just too small for them.
Yeah, I'm thinking of when you think of something like air tightness or you think of rain screen products. I mean, rain screen products traditionally were in the really wet climates. So you think of BC and the coast, and you think of the East Coast in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. But because of our air, because of our wind, because of the way things perform in Alberta, adopting some of these things make a huge difference or a huge benefit to what we're seeing here. So having that harmonized code means that manufacturers now will be able to take their materials to market knowing that they can spread them across the entire country. So then the benefits of having this harmonized code throughout the country is that every 1.5 to 2 years after the model energy code comes out, now we have a harmonized code across the country instead of having it, come to fore whenever the provinces feel like it. So now, when we think of Alberta, the 2023 National Building Code Alberta Edition will come into effect on May 1st of 2024. So when we think of that, what are the changes that we're going to see? Well, there's some minor changes that are going to happen with stairs and windows. CSA 440 changes a little bit, but the big one that we really want to focus on is what's happening with the energy code. We've got a brand new tier code that we're going to be talking about. And with that tier code, there's some substantial changes that will start here. It's not going to affect us hugely in the first tier, but once we get into tiers 2, 3, 4, 5, we start to really get into some heavy duty energy efficiency. So reduction in heat loss, performance of our mechanical systems, air tightness is a big one, types of windows we do, peak cooling loads. So we are really going to explore what those changes are and try and give you some detail on what's going to happen. In fact, just this first video, this first webinar, we are going to give you an overview, but you'll want to stay tuned. What are some of the upcoming videos that we're also going to be looking at?
In this series of videos, we're going to talk about the prescriptive versus performance changes, the air tightness changes, peak cooling loads, as well as building envelope.
So we're going to start with an overview of everything that's going to change in that energy portion of the code. And like you said, then we're going to get more detailed in each one. So first of all, we want to make sure that you understand what the overall changes are and how they impact you right away. And then we can go into a little more detail in the series. So when we think about the new tier codes, we think about moving towards net zero. For instance, net zero is where we produce the same amount of energy as we use. And we're going to move towards net zero ready. And net zero ready means that our houses will be energy efficient and perform really, really well. And all we have to do then is add some kind of renewable energy to them to make them net zero. So that's the goal, and that goal comes from outside influences beyond Canada. That comes from national accords through international nations who get together and they make these policies. The policies are moved to Canada. Canada takes those policies on, builds the national model codes, and then the provincial is established so that the provincial codes come into play and really are built in a way that they will affect just what's happening here in our province. So that's why it's important to understand some of the history. You know, why do we have to do this? You know, one of the first things that people talk about when there's a code change is, well, why do we have to change the code? That doesn't make sense. That doesn't work for us here. So we're trying to explain where this comes from, how we get there, and what we need to understand, because codes are going to continue to change. And if we don't follow that, we're going to be left behind. And so that's where we need to be aware of those things.
And this isn't very new either. BC has had their step code in place for a number of years already. So our industry has some expertise and practice on how we can get to all these different tiers.
Yeah, exactly. And when we think about the code and the implementation coming to Alberta, what we want to fine tune is, what does it take in tier 1? What does it take in tier 2? And as we move from these steps, why are we allowed to move in these steps? And how does that change how we view the entire building code? So that's why we wanted to build this webinar to explain some of those details.
The other benefit of the changing building codes is it slowly moves us forward towards that net zero ready goal. You know, as we look at it, our industry, we have our forefront builders who are leading the charge into all the new technologies, and we do have those out there who will do just the minimums that they need to do. And by pushing this code slowly forward, it allows those stragglers to move forward, and of course those ones who want to lead the pack are going to step away again and move forward. Yeah,
exactly. But by giving this information to you guys, what we really want to be able to do is, whether you're one of the leaders, whether you're in the middle of the pack, or whether you're a bit of a straggler, we don't want you to be caught off guard. We want you to understand what's coming, what's going to change, and how you have to adapt, because there are some fairly significant changes in specific areas that could catch a lot of people off guard. So that's where we're going to go into some of these details as we discuss this over the next few minutes.
Our industry is broken into 3 segments. We have those meeting the minimum requirements, those in the middle, and we have the leaders of the pack. And what these building codes do as we move forward is it pulls those minimum code builders into that middle group, and as they move forward, those ones who want to stay ahead are going to step forward again, and it really starts to move this forward for us. And it works. Since 2000, the residential energy has increased only 11%. Without these energy codes, it would have gone up by 43% or more.
So that's a good point, Ken. What if it doesn't work though? You know, when you think about the building codes, a lot of times we feel like they're forced on us. You know, we have to make the changes. So we don't have to make the changes without being involved though. We can become involved. We can get involved in building code committees. We can get involved in public reviews. So each time the code is rewritten, first of all, it goes out for a committee review, and the committee looks at it for technical details. They have submissions that come in from around the country to say, you know, this portion of the code either doesn't make sense or doesn't work for our area. So then what they do is the committee will review that, come up with some language that meets what these individuals have asked for, and then they'll send it out for public review. And in that public review process, you and I have an opportunity to review that. So all we have to do is say Google, you know, public building code reviews, and we'd be able to see what is being reviewed, put our 2 cents worth, and then we can feel like we're part of the process. Because thinking of that process, you know, once we get to the point where it's a national code and now it's going to be adopted for Alberta, we leave it up to the professionals in Alberta to determine which parts of that code that fit the Alberta climate. But when it comes to the overall national code, we do have a strong say in there. So when we think of how we can make that work, you know, 2025 code is coming out fairly soon for review, and we can have a say in that.
So where does everybody get this building code now?
Well, the building code comes from municipal affairs. So Alberta Municipal Affairs publishes the building code. In fact, if you go to their website, Alberta Municipal Affairs, you could even just Google Municipal Affairs Alberta Building Code. And what you'll find is a whole list of not only the current building code, but older building codes. But what happens is right now with the new building code that's just been released, you're going to find that you probably have to go to the National Research Council or NRC website to get that free copy from their virtual store, and you can just download that free copy. Comes as a nice PDF. I know you like to have a paper copy.
I like the paper.
I used to like the paper, but the nice thing about the PDF is if you see the word air tightness, for instance, and you click on that, it'll bring up everywhere in the entire code that the word air tightness is used. So they've made it really easy to use. It's free, throw it on your phone, you can carry it with you. So really it helps us to be able to get to know the code a little bit better.
So with the introduction of these tiered codes, it is the roadmap for our net zero ready, which is our energy efficiency reduction as well as greenhouse gas reduction. And there's a lot of benefits of starting with tier 1 of that building code.
So like you mentioned, you know, some of the benefits when we think of the tier codes is, you know, first of all, people are freaked right out sometimes about, oh boy, you know, we're going into tier code 1 and then next year it's 2 and 3 and 4. Well, that's not true. We're into tier code 1. So we can calm down. Tier code 1, there's no change in the insulation values per se and in the overall performance. But even when we get into tier code 2, we're only seeing a 5% increase in reduction in heat loss and a 10% overall performance. In tier 3, we jump up to 10% heat loss and a 20% overall improvement. So we're not, you know, we've got a long period of time before we're going to see some significant changes in the tier code. So we can really relax a little bit, figure out what's in tier code 2, tier code 1, and then we've got some time to get into tier code 2. So that's why we want to get into this information and make sure you really understand it so you're not going to be, you know, losing sleep at night.
The status quo is a really nice way to start our energy efficiency. And the reason being is it's going to give us some practice on the metrics that we're going to need as we reach tier 2, 3, and beyond.
Yeah, so a lot of the changes in the first tier are really to do with some of the minor things, like we don't have to do mandatory air tightness testing. We're looking at some peak cooling loads, which is one of the biggest things, and a lot of times that's a way that we cheat the system in the old building code, is to be able to change solar heat gain, and that would give us more efficiency in the wintertime. But we got to look at overheating because of climate change and other things. So really the benefits of this code are that we're going to take care of not just the energy efficiency, but the health and safety and the welfare of people who are living in homes that are produced under this new code.
So with the new 2024 National Building Code Alberta edition, we have 3 new subsections that have been added in. We have 9.366 for air tightness, 9.367 for tiered performance, and 936.8 for tiered prescriptive.
Right. Those can be a little bit confusing because I looked at that and when you read that language in the actual code, and that's one thing to keep in mind is don't trust what we say. We're giving you our opinions of what the code says, but always get a hold of the code and look it up for yourself. Or even AMA or Municipal Affairs has a email address where you can send them a question and they'll give you the provincial interpretation of that item. So, when we think of those new code clauses, the question comes up, well, what, I have to do air tightness? Well, number one, in 936.6, you don't have to do mandatory air tightness. There's a little adjustment in air tightness. When you think of 936.7 is our performance model that we use now. The one thing that people are a little bit concerned about is the peak cooling loads, but at the time that we were recording this video, we know that that is a bit of an issue down the road, but we're pretty confident that that's going to be addressed. So at this time, we understand from Municipal Affairs what we understood. Now remember, you got to double check it with them. You can send them an email, but we understand that they're not requiring us to follow 936.7, that specific section. So we still rely on 936.5, which is the performance part, or 936.2-4, which is the prescriptive or the prescriptive trade-offs. And then when we get into point 8, that's the prescriptive requirement to getting into the tiers. But remember, in the first tier, we don't get into a lot of extra stuff because we remain at a 0 increase in energy loss and a 0 increase in performance value. So it's really just tweaking the model. So hopefully that puts your mind at ease a little bit. Moving forward, yes, we have some work to do on peak cooling loads, but at the time of this recording, we're pretty confident that those things are going to be addressed.
So as part of this new building code change, there is a focus on the building envelope. And it's things like our windows, solar heat gains for our windows. We talk about the U value in windows when we get into some of these new stages. And we talk about the insulation inside of it and air tightness. Are our homes too airtight?
Well, that's a big topic because when you talk to the trades on site and you come in, you're doing air tightness testing or you're talking about air tightness, their first thing is, we build our houses way too tight. That's why we have so many problems. And realistically, that's partially true. But the whole story is we either need to build a building super airtight or super air leaky. And the reason is because it's the heat loss and the air movement that drives things out. So we need to understand the history to get to where we are today. When we look at older houses, the reason houses in the 60s, the 70s performed so well is there was so much airflow through them, nothing got trapped. We didn't need ventilation because there was so much natural ventilation through there. So we need to be able to make a house super airtight, but we need to exchange air within the building, not into the envelope, not into the wall studs and cavities, but actually from outside in to bring fresh dry air in, and then from inside out to take that humid air out. So that's some of the challenge, is getting people to understand why things worked in the past and why they don't work today. So that's really a struggle when it comes to trying to teach people about energy efficiency. The battle between moisture control and the battle between energy efficiency, because they do tend to oppose each other. So when we focus on the building envelope, focus on the weaknesses in the system, that's another part of understanding the building code and why we're moving in that direction when it comes to things like air tightness.
Yeah. And in the air tightness, when we're getting these buildings tighter and tighter, you're correct. We need to get to a spot where we don't have these random large holes in our envelope, because it can create other concerns and problems as our buildings age.
Yeah, exactly. So you think of something simple, like everybody talks about attic rain. Well, attic rain, plain and simple, is not ventilation, right? And that's the first thing everybody wants to do, is ventilate. But when you have attic rain, it's air leakage from the building into the attic. Now, what pushes the air into the attic? Well, you have stack pressures or you have mechanical pressures. But the real issue is the air going into the attic. So, you know, a lot of times people will think of things like a frosty day. You drive around outside and you get frost all over the trees. Well, what's that from? Well, you got too much moisture in the air. So when we apply that to the building code, we apply that to what's being done in houses, understanding where the code is going, and even though it's not a building science document, it does work us through that to help us to appreciate air tightness, ventilation, and making sure those things are done in the correct methods.
So with air tightness in mind, the changes that we're seeing at Tier 1, we still have that option to use our 925 requirements or move into our 936, more supportive, little tighter envelope design.
Right, exactly. So we think of that new section of air tightness, 936.6, we really don't get into that in Tier 1. We stick with 925, which is really to keep us out of trouble, you know, prevent condensation in the walls, attics, things like that. You know, we're familiar with what the 3.2 air changes are, so that doesn't change. When we get to 936, we get the option, you know, now to use different air changes, air tightness, but more energy efficient. So either one that we choose to use will keep us out of trouble. 936 will give us more efficiency. Not to say that, you know, you want to stick to those super, you know, reasonably high numbers. You want to try and get it as tight as possible, which has other benefits, but you know, we don't have to really worry about that. We can do that at our own pace.
The beautiful piece that I look at with this new implementation is it really gives us practice. There are so many little spots in our building envelope that require special detail as we move forward, as our homes get more airtight, to help control that air infiltration. So by allowing this mix between the two of them, it's going to prevent costly errors, and it's not going to slow down our projects.
And we are going to go into a lot more detail in subsequent videos on air tightness, but just to give you an idea, when you make a house more airtight, it's one of the most economical and inexpensive ways to improve your energy efficiency. You know, moving from where you are down to say a 1.0 air tightness can save you as much as, you know, 11-12% right just on that point. So, you know, it's a good way to be able to practice as we move forward to the higher tiers. You know, we get into tiers 4 and 5, we get into that need to get to those numbers. Right now we don't need to, we can practice and really, like you said, take our time and get it right.
So in the current building code that we have, we do have these prescriptive and performance tiers. Those are going to continue on. The addition that is new to the building code, but not new to us in Alberta, is that EnerGuide equivalent. The main difference between that is a mandatory blower door. There's a lot of benefits between having this prescriptive and performance paths in the building code. Flexibility between the two of them is key. I've worked with a lot of builders who we've started one way, we went to another, and it was gave them as the builder to make the choices which are going to be best for them and their client as we're building our homes.
Yeah, if you think about the difference between performance and prescriptive, flexibility really is a key word there, because you think of building with performance, you're building to a minimum standard, but you're adjusting everything so that you get the total energy usage. So it might be increased insulation in the walls and increased in the attic, but you're decreasing in somewhere else. The advantage to the prescriptive, on the other hand, if you think of prescriptive, it's just X in the wall, X in the roof, you know, you're just following a prescriptive pattern. But something like a house that has a huge percentage of glass, very hard to do it in performance, but very easy to do it prescriptively. So you have these differences or these nuances between the two, and really it comes down to what you're doing as well. When you think of how you want to build, if you don't mind putting that extra insulation in, you really want to give your customer something really, really good, then the flexibility of choosing one or the other is really good. And so like you said, Kent, with the EnerGuide, I mean, you have that flexibility then with EnerGuide. If you want to use it for, the addition to your Built Green program, you want to use it for Energy Star program, something else, you have that EnerGuide program that really mimics the performance path. So you're already doing everything exactly the same for both. The only difference really is that at the end of an EnerGuide, you need to do that air tightness test to put on the actual number, because they want to know the actual number, not just that it meets the building code. So really the flexibility in performance versus prescriptive and then adding the EnerGuide is fantastic.
One of the major concerns that I was getting back from some of my clients was this stop at tier 2 for that prescriptive requirement. And if you've been part of any of the public reviews of the 2025 building code, they are proposing to have that continue on for us, to continue with the flexibility in order for us to reach all of those tiers moving forward.
So it does give us the flexibility when you think of these codes and these tiers. We can't look ahead too far. We can see what's coming in the 2025 national code, which will come to Alberta a couple years after that. But we're not even into our current 2023 code, which is coming out shortly. So, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves and think, well, what am I going to do next? But at least this helps us to plan and figure out what we're doing for tier 1. We know tier 2 is not too far off, just a little bit of an increase. And then we can look ahead and say, do we want to continue with performance? Do we want to use EnerGuide? Do we want to use prescriptive? I mean, those are the flexible options that the tier code allows us to do. And we know from history, when we look at BC and how their step codes have progressed, these things have been introduced and adjusted and changed. So I'm pretty confident that, we're not going to have serious issues, although there is some little hiccups along the way. So when it comes to performance or prescriptive or EnerGuide ratings, one thing to consider is the energy auditor. So for instance, if you're doing prescriptive, you just pull out of the code and you go, it's X on the wall, X on the roof. You just follow that prescriptive format and that goes onto the blueprints and that's what you built. When it comes to performance, now the energy advisor can come in and go, okay, well, if you put these windows, you can adjust this insulation. If you put this ventilation or this heating system, you can adjust this. And so you can get a better idea of what the budget might be, where the factors are that the homeowner wants, what considerations they want. Do they want more air tightness? Do they want this? Do they want this? But they can't afford this. So it helps you to put that together. But that can also be done in-house. Somebody in-house can do that Hot 2000 because there's a free version online. And then with the EnerGuide program, when you do an EnerGuide report, you're going to use a registered energy advisor. And that individual has been trained and has taken the exams that Natural Resources Canada requires so that they can be registered. And then when they do that performance modeling, they also do the blower door test at the end. And that gives you this label that says it's been done and certified by a third party that this is the energy efficiency.
And there is a difference between energy advisors. So as they go through your training, there are energy advisors who specifically and only work with existing houses. When we start looking into new construction and code compliance, the knowledge base is different. When we walk into an existing house, the house is built as how it's built. We only need to document those pieces. When we're starting on a building code cycle, we now do need to know all those little bits of nuances of what can we do to make this home more efficient, more cost effective, what is the goal of the builder, and really work through that. As well as there are areas of the building code that as a new home energy advisor that we need to be more familiar with than a registered energy advisor that only works in existing homes.
Yeah, that's a good point, because if I think of the training that I received when we started doing EnerGuide ratings, we go out, we measure out the house, we're looking for volumes and we're looking for insulations, but when you're doing new homes, you have that added additional burden of having to meet the building code. You're not just referring to what's already there, you're actually meeting the building code. So if I make a recommendation to you based on what I think is the best, I have to refer back to the building code and make sure it actually meets that building code too. So with performance, prescriptive, EnerGuide, if you're still worried about that, that's one thing that we can help you with. We've got some subsequent videos coming out that'll give you a little more detail on those topics. So if you're still unsure, don't worry about it. We're going to cover those coming up. But in the meantime, there's a few other changes that we want to talk about. If we talk about things like performance and the involvement of your energy advisor, they can get involved in some of the things, some of the little nitty-gritty details in the building code that will be changing, which you don't even need to know about. It's just calculation methods, for instance, how we do our domestic hot water calculations. And kind of as a side point, if you think about it, why do we know so much about this already? The code's just coming out. Well, it's because the national code, the model code, has been out for almost 2 years. So we've been diligently studying that to see what it contains. Now we can apply, with the new code that Alberta has just released, we can apply that and say, what does the national say? What does the Alberta code say? So that really ties it together nicely, and that's something you can do too. You can pull up a copy of the newer codes before it reaches Alberta, and you can learn about that. But maybe tell us some of the other details that are changing there, Ken.
Well, the two details that have come up that had people curious and wondering how big a change is this? It's a really minor change. So the first one is our gas-fired furnaces. We've moved from a 92 AFUE to a 95 AFUE. That product we're already using in most of our homes. Your contractors are already bringing these in for you. The other one is in our domestic hot water. They've changed how we're measuring the efficiency of them. They moved from an energy factor to a uniform energy factor, but the actual product is not changing. It's just the metric on how it is. So it is really important to talk to your contractors, ask them, we have a small change, does this affect me or does this not? And I'm going to say most likely they're going to look at you and say, we're good. We already have this stuff in stock. We're ready to go.
Yeah. And you can always email AMA, ask them a question. You can always contact either the contractor who's working with you on the house, energy advisor. So there's lots of options for people that you can ask these questions of. But don't forget to pick up a free copy, download it, and review some of the notes in that new building code. And then even as you're going along in these subsequent videos, you'll be able to identify points that we're talking about and reference it back to that building code copy.
As this building code is focused on energy efficiency, some of the other conversations that are coming out of that is greenhouse gases and the difference. Is there a difference between greenhouse gas and energy efficiency?
Well, and that's the thing to look at here, because the building code doesn't deal with greenhouse gases. The building code deals with energy efficiency. So if you look at the overall communications that we receive, people talk about net zero carbon, they talk about net zero efficiency, they talk about greenhouse gases. Really, they're all talking about the same thing, just different points of the same thing. So if you're worried about greenhouse gases, we're worried about the environment and changes to the environment, what do we have to do to reduce greenhouse gases? We have to release less carbon into the atmosphere, which means energy efficiency becomes more important. So that's where the building code focuses on. Yes, if we follow the building code requirements and we reduce the use of energy, then that does lead to reduction in greenhouse gases and carbon emissions. So if we focus on what the building code is asking us to do, and in fact, if we go beyond the building code, I don't like going just to a minimum standard, but if we go beyond the building code, then what that helps us to do is contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gases. So we are working in harmony. It's just that, the language sometimes that's used can be a little bit confusing. So I wouldn't worry about too much of those things. Follow what the building code's saying about energy efficiency. It reduces the overall energy consumption, and that's the goal towards reduction in greenhouse gases.
So we've moved ourselves into a finished home so we can begin to talk about peak cooling loads, what they were and why are they now a new metric. We talked about the building code itself is really aiming for energy efficiency, and how we combat that in the last round was we used high solar gain glass. That allowed us to reduce that energy load, and the byproduct of that, and what we learned, is we started overheating some of our spaces.
Yeah, when we think about using that, I know a lot of builders found that it was an easy way to meet the energy code, because if you use a high solar gain, in other words, you're getting lots of heat from the sun through the glass, what that does is it allows you to reduce the insulation values in other areas. So it was a very effective way, and it's a really smart way of doing it, because you've got this free energy that you want to take advantage of. The problem is, in the summertime, when the shading is not there, you continue to get that heating load. So unless you build a whole bunch of protection and shading and things like that, it's very hard to deal with. So that's why the peak cooling load was introduced, because events like excessive heat over the summer can create all sorts of health issues, safety issues for people if they move into a building and they're overheating that building.
I wanted to add to that is that as we move forward with climate change, we have these lower heating degree days that are beginning to occur within our climate. We also have prolonged periods of extreme temperatures.
So when we get that, that's a good point, because when we have too much overheating, sometimes, especially in some of the provinces, we'll get these extended 2, 3, 4-week periods of over 30 degrees Celsius. So you can imagine if you're in a house where you've taken advantage of the sun for the winter heat to get that free heat to cool or to keep the house warm, now all that summer, through that 3 or 4 week period, you're going to significantly overheat. And when you think of vulnerable people, people who are elderly, people who are affected by that, young children, different things, you don't want to cause them issues. So that's why this is such an important factor. Now, one of the topics that's come up is, can we build certain houses, certain model types, because of this peak cooling load? So the calculation right now appears to be a little bit off. Now we know it's being addressed in the next code cycle, but because we know that it's an issue with the calculation, I'm pretty confident that the government is taking steps to make sure that through this cycle we can get things done without it affecting us. And from what I've heard so far, even moving into the new code release starting in the summer here, we won't have that problem, because that particular section of the code will not be something that they're going to enforce right away. So even during Tier 1, we shouldn't see that problem. So we have some time to work through some of these bugs to get that taken care of. So when it comes to some of the takeaways, if you think of what the changes are going to be, there's not a huge change in the amount of insulation. For instance, we don't have to get into adding exterior insulations. We don't have to improve the performance other than looking at the mechanical system and going from a 92% furnace to a 95% AFUE furnace. So those are some of the basic things that we wanted to, you to remember in this takeaway. Kent, what are some of the other things that you would take away from this?
Well, and I think you covered it very, very well. As our number one takeaway is the changes that are occurring are going to be small and they're going to be in stages. So we're going to be able to adapt very easily to what's coming along. And of course, get a copy of the building code. It's free. You can download it. You can put it on your phone. You can put it anywhere. You can print off pages to put in your truck. Get yourself a copy of the building code so we can continue having great conversations with the industry.
Yeah, and you know what about that building code? You can put it on your phone, and I find that if you want to search a specific word, you just type it in, it'll find every word in the code with that. So fantastic way to have a copy of the code with you so that you can look at that information directly right out of that document. Don't rely on what everybody tells you, look at the document. On behalf of Kent and I, we appreciate you tuning in to this webinar, and we look forward to seeing you in the next series.